Hi, I'm Dan with True North Motos. We're going to go over the install of a 2020 KTM XABR rack system. When you unbox your rack, you get a left and a right side. And then you will get your top plate with the rubber damper already installed. In your hardware pack, you'll get all this hardware right here. Starting for the right side of the bike, this will replace your lower rear brake pivot bolt. This will replace the rear brake caliper lower mounting bolt. This is a top rack mounting bolt. This is the left side. This is going to be the other top rack mounting bolt. This will replace the lower left subframe mounting bolt. These are your top plate bolts. The nuts have a locking feature, so no lock washer is needed. You will need Loctite on this bolt, and this bolt. On the lower rear brake pivot bolt, you'll reuse the stock nut that comes off. The spacer goes on the lower left mount. These spacers will both be on the rear mounts with these longer bolts. Tools required for the install: ratchet extension, 15mm socket, 13mm socket, 10mm socket, 8mm socket, and a 5mm Allen, 10mm wrench, and a 13mm open end wrench. All right, now we're going to talk about what's needed to prep the bike before we install the rack. We're going to need to remove the pivot bolt for your rear brake pedal. Remember, you will reuse the stock nut. And you also need to remove the 8mm bolt that holds the bottom of the rear master cylinder. Before you install your rack, hold it up into place and line up these two bolts and use a Sharpie or some type of marker to mark a cutout for your for your side plastic frame guard. You can use a Dremel, shears. We use a bandsaw to cut this out. Moving to the other side of the bike. The only thing you need to remove on the left side of the bike is this subframe lower mount bolt. Now on the back of the bike, underneath, there'll be two 8mm bolts that bolt your sub fender on. Take those out, and if we move to the top here real fast, you'll see that this has already been hole sawed, so the spacers can sit in there for the top mounts. We use a 1-inch hole saw, and the way that I mark the location for these is you take a pick, something sharp that'll fit up through the bottom of the hole. You'll go underneath with the bolt out. You can put this all the way through. And if you come around the side of the bike right here, you can see where it'll make a mark into the plastic. And that's where you'll put the bit out of your hole saw to start the center of the hole. If you keep up on our website, we will be offering these side panels pre-drilled. We're just waiting for some of them to get into stock. All right, now we will install the rack on the motorcycle. So we're going to start with the right side of the bike. I always start with the top mounting bolt. So take your spacer, get your mounting bolt through the top, and hold it up onto here. Start it by hand. It'll eventually seat down like that. And we're going to do a lower bolt down here. Now when installing the rack, it's important that you don't tighten any bolt until every bolt is started on the bike. I'm going to be using an impact on part of this. I will not be tightening the bolts with an impact, and I will be starting every one of them by hand. All right. Take the rear brake pivot bolt. Get that through there and start the nut on the back side of it. Okay, I'm moving to the left side of the bike. Again, we recommend starting with the upper mount. Get the bolt through. Start it by hand. Okay, I'm gonna grab your 3/8 ID spacer. That'll sit right in here. Remember to Loctite this bolt. Okay. Ratchet wants to work. Remember to leave it loose. Okay, now we're going to take our top plate. Get all the bolts started on here. You will have to pull the rack and get it lined up. One of the reasons that you leave everything loose until it's time to tighten everything for final torque. All right, now we're going to take these two 10mm nuts. You don't need a lock washer. They also have the locking feature on the nut, the built-in washer. You can come underneath here. You'll see where the upper mount bolts came down. Start the nut on there. All right, now that you have everything loosely installed, and the reason we want to do this is to make sure that the rack aligns correctly. This is a modular system, so you want to leave everything loose, and then you can come back to the back of the bike and kind of make sure that your arms come out at the same place and that your rubber is in the center of your fender and that it's touching. After you make sure this is done, you can go through and tighten everything up on the bike. So we'll start with this lower subframe bolt down here. I'm going to get everything good and snug, and we'll come back and torque these. Torque spec for this bolt in the manual is 22.1 foot-pounds. Move to the other side. 15 millimeter and 13 millimeter nut on the back. This is an M10 bolt. They don't list a spec for the rear brake pivot bolt in my manual. All the other M10 bolts for the remaining chassis screws say 33.1 foot-pounds. I don't think you need to go that tight on this because it has Loctite, so we'd suggest between 25 and 30 foot-pounds. If you can find a torque spec on this, let us know and shoot me an email. These are M6 bolts. 7.5 foot-pounds is all these need. Loctite as well. Come back and tighten your top bolts. These go through a brass insert from the subframe. The strength of this rack is because it sits on a spacer on top of your subframe and clamps from the bottom. 7.5 foot-pounds on these as well. No need to over tighten them. Now once you got those tightened on the top, you're gonna come underneath and you're gonna wanna hold the top and tighten the nut on the bottom to hold your sub fender on. We'll go to the other side. Okay. Last piece to tighten down will be your top plate hardware. 5mm Allen and 13mm. I recommend that you get it snug and then don't tighten with the Allen on the top because they're easier to strip. Do the finish torque on the nut. Move around to the other side. To remove the system, and it is a modular design, but you don't have to take the top plate off once you've installed the rack. Really all that's necessary is to remove this hardware right here, this side, and the other side, and the rack can pivot and slide back off. It can come off in about 3 minutes. Super easy on and off the bike once you've done it once. That is the installation and removal instructions for the 2020 KTM XABR rack system by True North Motos.